"You think you can shoot better than the boys, sweetheart?" The line sliced through the heat of Redwood Falls like a slap meant to leave a mark. Sergeant Trent Maddox stood there holding a crumpled $100 bill between his fingers, wearing a grin that made it clear he thought the win was already in his pocket. Behind him, 4 Marines laughed. The rough kind of laughter people use when they've already decided someone isn't worth taking seriously. They saw the faded red jacket, the civilian clothes, the blonde ponytail. They saw someone they figured they could embarrass for beer money and bragging rights. What they didn't notice was the tiny compass rose tucked behind her left ear, inked after missions that never showed up on any official paperwork. In about 60 seconds, Maddox would realize he'd just mocked someone whose last confirmed shot was taken at 900 meters in conditions that would have sent him crying for backup. And the best part was, she wasn't planning to explain anything. She intended to let the shooting do the talking. The public range outside Redwood Falls sat a few miles off the main road, a strip of concrete bays and sun-bleached wooden benches where Marines burned through weekend ammo. The air carried the familiar mix of burnt powder and dry sage, the kind of scent that sank into your clothes and stayed there. Late afternoon light stretched across the dirt, making heat shimmer behind the target frames. Riley Calder waited at Bay 7, hands tucked in her jacket pockets, quietly watching the Marines at Bay 5 chew through a box of 9mm with more enthusiasm than accuracy. She was 29, 5'6", and moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd carried 80-pound packs across mountains where one wrong step meant a broken ankle and a long, lonely wait for extraction. Her blonde hair was tied back in a simple ponytail, and she wore a white tank under the red jacket, worn jeans, and hiking boots with more miles on them than most people's cars. Nothing about her looked military. Nothing about her looked dangerous. But if you watched long enough, you'd notice how she stood. Balanced, relaxed shoulders, eyes tracking movement without really trying. No fidgeting, no checking her phone. Just this quiet presence that made people glance away without knowing why. Sergeant Trent Maddox spotted her first. 31, built solid, carrying the confidence of a Marine marksmanship instructor who knew he was good and made sure everyone else knew it too. 8 years training fresh recruits, 3 consecutive expert badges. He'd built his whole reputation on being the guy who could outshoot anyone on the line. He'd been watching her for a good 10 minutes, studying the way she handled the rental Glock 19 like she was already bored with it. If you're watching from anywhere in the world, thanks for tuning in. And if this story hits the way it should, go ahead and hit subscribe. Major Tom's Tales keeps these stories alive. Maddox leaned toward Sipo Ryan Holt, a 21-year-old fresh out of SOI, and said something that made Holt snicker. Then Maddox walked over, that $100 bill already out like it was part of a rehearsed act. Riley didn't look up at first. She was loading a magazine with smooth mechanical motions. Press check, slide forward. No wasted energy. When she finally glanced his way, her expression stayed flat. No smile, no annoyance, nothing. Just enough emptiness to make Maddox's grin twitch before he pulled it back together. Her fingers drifted to the small tattoo behind her left ear. The compass rose, barely the size of a dime, usually went unnoticed, but it carried a meaning Maddox couldn't even begin to guess. Riley Calder had grown up in a 2-bedroom house in Redwood Falls, Colorado, where her father taught her to shoot before she ever learned to ride a bike. He was a Vietnam veteran, Army infantry, a man who didn't waste words but somehow said everything through the way he moved. When Riley turned 7, he took her out into the open country with a Ruger 1022 and a box of 22 rounds. He told her shooting wasn't about the gun at all. It was about breathing, stillness, making a choice and living with it. She missed the first 30 shots. He didn't correct her. He just reloaded the magazine, placed it back in her hands, and let her try again. By sunset, she finally tapped the tin can at 50 yards. Her father didn't praise her. He simply nodded and said, "Good. Do it again tomorrow." That simple line stuck with her through high school, through the recruiter's door, through Marine Recruit Depot San Diego, where she learned fast that being a woman in the Corps meant working twice as hard for half the credit. She pushed through infantry training at Camp Pendleton, then went after Scout Sniper School, one of the first women allowed to try after the combat ban lifted. At 22, she earned the 03 designation, one of only a few women to pull it off. Then came Helmand Province. She was assigned to 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines, attached to a force recon element operating in the Sangan district in late 2012. Her spotter was Essent Mason Reed, a 34-year-old from Georgia, who treated her like a kid sister and never once doubted her skill. They spent 6 months in that desert, trading 2-hour shifts, tracking high-value targets through compounds that smelled like goats and old smoke. The night Reed died, they were covering an assault on a Taliban commander's compound. Riley was on the M45 chambered in 300 Win Mag, scanning rooftops as the team moved in. She caught the glint of a shooter half a second too late, an insurgent with a PKM perched on a rooftop 180 meters northwest. She fired, center mass, and the man dropped, but not before he squeezed off a burst. Reed took 3 rounds to the chest. 2 hit plate. The third slipped through the gap above his collar. Riley called it in, pressed her hands against the wound, doing everything TCCC had drilled into her. Pack the wound, pressure dressing, airway, breathing checks. But the medevac took 9 minutes, and Reed bled out in 6. He died staring at her, trying to say it wasn't her fault. She didn't believe him then. She still doesn't. After Helmand, Riley did one more deployment in 2014, stacking more confirmed kills than she cared to remember, and earning the Compass Rose ink, given only to snipers who'd run operations that never made it into briefings. When her contract ended in 2016, she walked away. No ceremony, no fanfare, just a DD-214 and a ghost that followed her everywhere. She moved back toward the Redwood Falls region, took work training executive protection teams, and tried to forget the sound of Reed choking on his own blood. But some sounds cling, some debts don't fade. Sergeant Trent Maddox wasn't a bad man, just someone who'd spent years being told he was exceptional until he believed the myth. He grew up in a small Ohio town where being a Marine was the highest badge a man could earn, and he'd worked himself raw to become one of the top marksmanship instructors at MCRD San Diego. He had stacks of badges, respect from his peers, and a reputation he wore like armor. And then a blonde civilian in a red jacket strolled onto his weekend range, acting like she belonged there. Maddox marched toward Bay 7 with that $100 bill still pinched between his fingers, 4 Marines trailing behind him like a pack sizing up prey. Sipasio, Ryan Holt, PFC Keenan Vale, Fit Leo Marquez, and Fit Evan Chan. All fresh out of SOI, all eager to impress their old instructor, all too young to know when to shut up. Maddox stopped 3 feet from Riley and tilted his head like he was trying to figure out what he was looking at. He told her he'd been watching her warm up and she seemed to know her way around a pistol. Said that was pretty impressive for a civilian. Then he held up the $100 bill and made his offer. 5 shots, 5 targets. Outshoot him and the cash was hers. Miss one, and she owed drinks at Willie's down the road. Riley stared at him for a long second. No smile, no argument. She just asked for the distance. Maddox grinned and nodded at the range officer, who was already setting up 5 silhouette targets at 25 yards. Standard IPSC papers, black and white with an A zone the size of a dinner plate. Simple shots for anyone halfway trained. But Maddox wasn't finished. He told the range officer to add wind flags, then turned back and said they'd shoot cold. No warm-ups, no sight tweaks, no excuses, just raw skill. Holt laughed, saying this would be the quickest 100 Maddox ever pocketed. Vale muttered she was probably a cop who'd taken a few academy classes. Marquez shook his head like he pitied her. Chan stayed quiet. He was the only one who noticed Riley's hands were perfectly still, while Maddox's hands were already fidgeting. Adjusting his grip, tightening his stance, checking his sights like he needed reassurance. Maddox loaded his personal Glock 19, press-checked the chamber, and strode up to the firing line with the confidence of a man who'd run this exact drill 1,000 times over. He set his stance, modified ISO, feet shoulder width, arms extended, breaths steady. When he called ready, the range officer hit the timer. 5 shots, 4 seconds. All 5 rounds landed center mass, tight enough you could cover the grouping with a coffee cup. Maddox stepped back and threw his arms up like he'd just won the Super Bowl. Holt whooped, Vale clapped, Marquez grinned and shook his head. Chan kept his eyes on Riley. Maddox turned toward her, tossing out a smug line about doubling the bet if she wanted to quit before embarrassing herself in front of real Marines. He said it with a grin that was supposed to sound friendly, but it came out more like a cheap insult wrapped in a smile. Riley set her rental Glock on the bench, dropped the magazine, locked the slide open, and checked the empty chamber. Then she reloaded with movements so smooth they looked like muscle memory carved into her bones. She stepped up to the line, shoulders squared, eyes downrange. The wind pushed west to east at 8 miles per hour, sun at her back, distance trivial. The pistol factory zeroed. She glanced at Maddox and told him she was ready. Riley's heart rate held at 58 beats per minute. She knew because she'd tracked it for years the way others count steps or calories. 58 was operational. 58 was the number she'd held in Helmand when Mason Reed was bleeding out in her arms, and the medevac was still 7 minutes away. She didn't look at Maddox. She focused on the targets. 5 silhouettes, 5 rounds, 5 chances to make the noise in her head go quiet. In her mind, she was back on that rooftop in Sangan. The M45 pressed against her shoulder. Reticle resting on a man who had no idea he only had 4 seconds of life left. Reed beside her, whispering wind calls over the radio, steady as always, even though they both knew the assault team below was walking into an ambush. She remembered the wind pushing the round, the automatic correction, the clean trigger brake. She remembered the target dropping, and then the PKM rattling half a second later. She remembered Reed falling beside her. She remembered how his blood looked black in the moonlight. Riley blinked, letting the rooftop fade until the range came back into focus. Maddox was still grinning. Holt was still laughing. Vale and Marquez were placing side bets. Chan was watching her hands. Her fingers brushed the compass rose behind her ear. That tattoo had burned for a week after they'd inked it in a tent outside Lashkar, and sometimes she swore she could still feel the needle. It was meant as an honor, a reminder, a promise she'd made to Reed in the back of a medevac that stank of copper and diesel. She'd told him she wouldn't waste it. She wouldn't let people like Maddox make her small. She'd make every shot count exactly the way he'd taught her. He didn't answer. He just looked at her with eyes already dimming. And then, he was gone. Riley breathed in, held it, let it out slow. Heart steady at 58. Hands steady. The wind shifted and she adjusted her stance by an inch without even thinking about it. Pure instinct. Years of training boiled into unconscious movement. She raised the Glock, front sight, trigger prep, 5 presses, 4 seconds. When the smoke thinned, Sergeant Trent Maddox wasn't smiling anymore. The range officer called ceasefire and walked downrange to check the targets. No one spoke. The wind popped the flags, the snapping cloth sounding like far-off gunfire. Maddox folded his arms, jaw tight like he was chewing something bitter. Holt stopped grinning. Vale looked like he'd witnessed a magic trick that broke his understanding of physics. Marquez stared at the targets as if they'd betrayed him personally. Chan looked unsurprised. The range officer lifted the first target. One hole, dead center, A zone. The second, same. Third, fourth, fifth, identical. 5 shots, 5 perfect center hits. Not close, not nearly centered, dead center. Holes so precise they looked stamped out by a machine. The kind of shooting nobody credited to luck. This was the kind of shooting that only came from years under pressures most people would never face. Maddox's expression shifted in real time. Confusion, disbelief, then that cold anger that shows up when a man realizes he's just been made to look like a fool in front of his own Marines. He told the range officer there had to be some mistake. Maybe the wind had stalled. Maybe she'd just gotten lucky. He insisted on running it again, double or nothing, at 50 yards if the range allowed. Riley didn't bother answering. She popped the magazine, locked the slide back, and set the Glock on the bench with the same steady calm she'd had since Maddox strutted over. Then she finally looked at him. And for the first time since this whole bet began, she spoke. She said she wasn't interested in double or nothing. The bet was done, and he owed her $100. No edge in her voice, no bragging, nothing meant to rub it in, just the plain truth. Maddox's jaw twitched. He glanced at Holt, who was staring at the ground. Vale shrugged helplessly. Marquez was still glued to the targets. Chan kept his eyes on Riley. Maddox yanked the bill from his pocket, crushed it into a ball, and tossed it at her feet. He snapped that she'd gotten lucky, and if she wanted to prove she wasn't a one-hit wonder, she could show up to Weapons Training Battalion at Pendleton next Monday and see how she measured up against actual Marines. He said it loud enough for half the range to hear. Riley bent down, picked up the bill, smoothed it out, and tucked it into her jacket. Then she told him she'd be there. Same even tone, same stillness, nothing shaken. Maddox blinked. That wasn't the reaction he expected. He'd assumed she'd take the win and vanish. But she wasn't disappearing. Holt finally found his voice and asked if she was serious. He reminded her WTBN wasn't some civilian range where anyone could wander in. She'd need sponsorship, paperwork, official clearance. Riley told him she knew someone who could handle it. She didn't explain, she didn't need to. She just repeated that she'd be there Monday at 0800, and if Maddox wanted to spice it up, he could design whatever course he thought would break her. Maddox flushed red. He told her she had no idea what she was signing up for. WTBN courses weren't made for casual shooters. They were built to crush Marines who thought they were tough. He promised she'd be done within the hour, and that when she quit, he'd make sure everyone heard about it. Riley held his stare for a long moment. Her fingers brushed the compass rose behind her ear one more time, and she turned toward the parking lot without another word. Chan watched her go. Then he leaned toward Maddox and muttered something quiet, something only the sergeant heard. Whatever it was, Maddox's face drained from red to pale in seconds. But Riley was already gone, and the sun dipped low over the coast, turning the sky the color of old blood. Monday morning arrived with fog rolling in off the water, thick enough to cut visibility down to 50 meters. Weapons Training Battalion sat on the east side of Camp Pendleton, a sprawling maze of ranges and classrooms that had shaped Marine marksmen since the 1950s. Riley showed up at AO 745 in the same red jacket, jeans, and boots. At the gate, Guys and Arturo Vega had already cleared her entry after hearing about the bet. Maddox waited at range 208 with a course he'd spent all weekend crafting. It wasn't a qualification, it was a gauntlet. 6 punishing stations, pistol transitions, barricade shooting, moving steel, low-light accuracy, stress fire under a shot timer, and a final 200-meter iron sight rifle shot with a 12mm crosswind. He'd invited 20 instructors to watch, every one of them a Marine marksmanship coach curious about the civilian woman who'd supposedly humiliated one of their own. Some smirked, some doubted. Vega just watched. Maddox handed Riley an M4 with iron sights, a service Glock 19, and 6 loaded mags. He told her she had 30 minutes to finish all 6 stations. More than 3 misses and she was done. Quit early, and she'd be escorted off base. Riley checked the chamber, nodded, and asked if Vega was scoring. Vega raised his hand. Riley looked at him and asked if he'd been in Helmand. Vega frowned and said he had, back in 2012 with 2-7. He asked why. Riley told him she'd been there too, attached to Force Recon running Overwatch in Sangin. She said her spotter was Essayant Mason Reed. She said Reed had been killed in action, and she'd carried his tags home herself. The range went quiet, the kind of silence that carries weight. Vega's expression shifted as he studied her. He asked what her MOS had been. Riley answered calmly, 0317, Scout Sniper. Vega looked from Maddox back to her, then asked if she'd earned the Compass Rose. Riley turned her head and brushed her hair aside, revealing the small tattoo behind her ear. The rose her unit reserved for snipers who'd worked missions that officially never existed. Vega let out a slow exhale and told Maddox he might want to rethink the difficulty of the course. Maddox went pale, but stubbornly shook his head. The course stood, he said, and if she was really as good as she claimed, she'd have no trouble. Riley stepped to the first station. Pistol transitions. 3 targets at 15 meters. She raised the Glock, fired 3 rounds, switched to the rifle and dropped 3 more. 6 hits, all center mass under 9 seconds. Station 2, barricade shooting. 4 targets at 25 meters from cover. She moved with a smoothness that barely looked human, each shot deliberate, each transition seamless. Station 3, moving steel at 30 meters. She tracked, led, and dropped every plate in under 11 seconds. By Station 4, the instructors had stopped whispering. By Station 5, Maddox had stopped watching altogether. By Station 6, the 200-meter iron sight shot in a 12-mile-per-hour crosswind, Vega was smiling. Riley adjusted for the wind, steadied her breathing, and pressed the trigger. The steel target rang out with a clean, echoing tone. Vega called the time, 22 minutes, 0 misses. The range stayed still for 3 long seconds. Then one instructor clapped, then another, and then everyone joined in. Maddox stood alone, arms crossed, face unreadable. Geisentank. Vega walked over while Riley was clearing the rifle and told her she'd just run the hardest course WTBN had without missing a single shot. In 20 years of teaching Marines, he said he'd never seen anyone do it faster or cleaner. He asked if she'd ever consider coming back as a guest instructor for advanced marksmanship. Riley considered the question, then nodded and said she'd think about it. Maddox stood 30 feet away with Holt, Vale, Marquez, and Chan beside him, none of them saying a word. Vega approached him and said Maddox had built a course that would have broken most active-duty Marines, and the civilian he'd been mocking had walked through it without even breaking a sweat. Vega told him he owed her an apology, and if he had any integrity, he'd give it. Maddox looked at Riley. She was packing her gear, her face calm and unreadable. He approached slowly, stopped a few feet away, and admitted he'd underestimated her. He said it wasn't an excuse, but he'd spent his whole career being the best shooter in the room, and he didn't know how to handle meeting someone better. Then he apologized. Riley told him she accepted it. Then she added something else, that being good wasn't about beating everyone around you. It was about being better than you were yesterday. Her dad told her that. Reed taught her that, and she intended to pass that lesson on. Maddox nodded. No handshake, no forced smile, just a quiet acknowledgement before he walked off. Chan lingered. He asked Riley if she'd really worked with Force Recon in Helmand. She said yes. He hesitated, then asked if it was true that Mason Reed had been her spotter. Riley held his gaze for a long moment before nodding. Chan told her he was sorry. He said Reed had been his platoon sergeant before sniper school, and Reed once told him the best shooter he'd ever worked with was a woman half the Marines underestimated. He said Reed told him she was the kind of Marine who made everybody around her better. Riley's throat tightened. She asked Chan what else Reed had said. Chan told her Reed believed she'd saved more lives than she'd ever taken, and that this, not her kill count, was the real measure of a sniper. Riley didn't cry. She just nodded, touched the compass rose behind her ear one more time, and walked toward the parking lot. The fog had started to lift, sunlight breaking through, and for the first time in years the weight on her shoulders felt just a little lighter.